Hi, everybody. Does it never end with Bryan Kohberger? Kohberger, as you know, stands accused of the slaughter of 4 innocent and beautiful students there at University of Idaho. And in the past days, we learn of reports that Kohberger was fired from his job as a teaching assistant there at WSU, Washington State University, about 10 miles away from where the murders occurred. With me is high-profile lawyer out of Jacksonville and also Fed former agent with the FBI, Dale Carson. Dale, what is your law firm website? Is it dalecarsonlaw.com?
It is.
Okay, I can't believe I knew that by heart. That's scary. So I guess if I ever get a DUI, I'll be calling you. What do you think about these reports? Now, you know he was a PhD student, and he was basically a teaching assistant, mentoring young students. He was at PhD level, so I guess they would have been at the either master or the undergraduate level, probably undergraduate level. And from what we're learning, he was let go because he had a, quote, sexist attitude toward women, and that he was, quote, rude to women and graded them differently than he graded men. I mean, doesn't that just fit hand in glove with a misogynistic anger toward women?
Absolutely. I mean, this is true of a misogynist who is full of himself. I mean, he's full of himself, and oftentimes these narcissists believe that they're really competent when they're not competent at all. They may be confident.
Now, wait a minute. I thought you were a former FBI agent and lawyer. When did you get your degree in psychoanalysis? Just curious.
You know, I did this. I taught this for the FBI.
Oh, darn. I thought I had you over a barrel. Well, it's hard for me to fight with teaching at Quantico. Okay, you beat me again. Go ahead, eating a dirt sandwich.
I see this as just consistent. Remember, previously in his other life, he was fired from the bar or prohibited from being in a bar for asking women what their addresses were.
Is that not creepy? Dale, don't use that pickup line. Especially don't let your wife find out you're using that pickup line at a bar. Hey, what's your home address, Sydney? I would run for the hills as if I had seen a monster.
Absolutely, you would. And of course, this may have been the triggering mechanism for this slaughter that happened in Idaho. I mean, this guy who clearly is not happy with women and is going to take advantage of them where he can, is angry now. He's been discharged as a teaching assistant where he's seeking a PhD. I mean, talk about humiliating. I mean, he's got to be just angry, boiling over. And now all of a sudden, people who were previously targeted become the target for his animus, his anger. And he drives over after he's been fired. He looks to make sure they're still there, which they are. And we know this from the actual, not wiretaps, but the looking at the transmission of his phone signal to the cell towers over repeatedly. And then he finally just snaps, and he does this to these victims.
Can I ask you something, Dale?
Yeah.
Okay. Dale Carson, FBI agent / lawyer / behavior analyst. Have you ever had a job where you had to, if not totally suck up to your boss, at least be nice to them? Ever? Have you ever had a job like that?
Well, of course.
Kohberger actually had an altercation with a professor just a couple of weeks into the job. I mean, you can't just get along for 2 weeks without fighting with another professor?
Well, you know, the only way to figure out what somebody's going to do in the future is to look at their past. And when you do this in connection with Kohberger, we can see that he is an individual who has a lot of anger and hostility, particularly toward women, And although this wasn't necessarily a predictable outcome, it certainly is an outcome that follows with the evidence. And in this particular case, there's a substantial body of evidence to suggest he did this crime. He may be innocent until proven guilty, but the substantial nature of the evidence against him seems irrefutable.
Del Carson, something I used to love to do when I was trying cases and still do it now. I like to take one piece of evidence, and I learned this from an earring that was found near the body of a Jane Doe who was the victim of who I believe was a serial killer. And we could get him on one case, one, where the earring was as opposed to the other earring, just a lot. And I thought about what can that one earring prove? It proved to me that the murder happened somewhere else, and this was a dumping site. It proved to me that there was a struggle because it had been ripped out of her ear. I mean, I went on and on and on. I ended up being able to prove like 4 or 5 things based on the location of the earring and how it got there. Let's think about this, Dale. Let's just think about this for a minute. He had an altercation with a professor just a few weeks into the job as a teaching assistant, a TA. Then, hold on, wait for it. Then he had to meet to discuss a problem with his professional behavior. They discussed the way he was treating women, that he was, quote, sexist, and graded them differently than he graded men. Sexist attitude, rude to men, graded women differently. Then later on, there was another altercation with a professor. Another altercation. It's like, and then he was officially terminated 10 days later. Don't you think he would have learned the first time he had an altercation with a professor? He's just a TA, a teaching assistant. They're a dime a dozen. They're a student that's making extra money or getting a break in tuition by helping, mentoring younger students. And he fought with the professor not once but twice. So my question is, what can we learn from his uncontrolled behavior and his lack of impulse control? And as you said in nicer words, when you don't know a horse, look at his track record. What will he do behind closed doors with a sleeping girl if he'll do this with a superior?
Well, here's the thing that frightens me. These women, and it's in the record, frankly, knew that there was something wrong with him. They knew, because fortunately, women have an ability to sense out that stuff, and it makes the hair stand up on the back of their necks, and they know that the person's going to be a problem. And clearly, that was information that was never fully metabolized by the institution where he was seeking his degree. And the fact that they kept asking him if he wouldn't change his behavior is a big clue about the universally bad manner in which students are instructed today. When I was growing up, if that had happened and you'd mistreated somebody and it came to everybody knew of it, all of a sudden you'd just be out of a job right then. There wouldn't be any time for you to think about whether or not you could improve your behavior. I mean, that's frightening to me. And all those women that he was attempting to teach.
Attempting to stalk. I wonder how many of them he actually stalked. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's exactly the mechanism. We know that molesters develop patterns and methodologies, really, for tracking potential victims.
Let's think this thing through, Dale. If he was being stricter on women in the grading than he was on men, I mean, if you want to get a date with somebody, the last thing you're going to do is give them a bad grade, right? So what does it mean that he desired women, but yet he was harder and more strict with women than he was with men? And also it tells me he cannot change his behavior, even in a professional sense. Like he can't stop himself.
It would be interesting to see which women were given good grades because that would give you an idea of his attempt to manipulate them into a position where he could take advantage of them.
Impulse control, for instance. He became obsessed with criminology. He wanted to work with police to go to crime scenes, see crime scene photos. That didn't work. That didn't fulfill him. It kept going and going till he stalked these people on social, started going to their house all the time, spying on them, breaks in. He still didn't stop. Then he attacks him, stabs him, still didn't stop, stab, 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 stab. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. We see that in this behavior. He treats one woman after the next rudely and in a sexist manner. He is reprimanded for it. There is no change. He could not stop, even though he knew he was risking losing his job. When he started stabbing, he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop himself at any point in the scenario we're laying out. That would be my argument.
Well, and of course, the pattern of these individuals who are so full of themselves, they don't think anybody else is right. So our opinions don't matter. His is the most important, and I can see him pressing that forward with his professors that are trying to correct his behaviors. It just wouldn't work. And of course, he was now in a situation where being cast out from that group would be just absolutely devastating, and he would have to blame somebody else. He couldn't absorb the blame himself. He couldn't say, you know what, I did this to myself. I should have behaved better. I shouldn't have been so hard on those students. But that's not his ability. His ability is to focus that energy on an outside party, and that's what, in my view, triggered the anger and frustration that appeared in that night that he slaughtered 4 people.
Also, what can I learn from this one incident? He had a meeting about his behavior with his bosses just before the murders.
Yes, and you know, although he's an organized killer from my perspective, there are 2 types: organized and disorganized. Mm-hmm. For the organized killer, time becomes really a critical feature. For disorganized killers, it's not a critical feature at all because they don't have any awareness of the time. Mm-hmm. The problem that happened for him in the killings was that he ran out of time. And he ran out of time. He couldn't prepare to clean up his act, if you will, or to hide evidence. And I know recently there's some information that you brought forward about 2 months ago when we started talking about this, and that's the sheath that he had, and that sheath that had Marine emblems on it. You know, there was some question about whether he left it or not to misdirect him, and that's current information. I mean, that's just coming out today. But you and I talked about that several months ago, that there was a good possibility he did that. His failing was to take enough time to make sure there was absolutely no DNA on that sheath. And of course, if you're to believe the government's position, it was they who found on the snap his DNA, which ultimately led to the affidavit for his arrest in Pennsylvania.
In another turn, we have learned that Pennsylvania police are sifting through cold cases for possible links to Bryan Kohberger. Now, we've been talking about that for a long time, but now we're getting official confirmation that 2 law enforcement offices in Pennsylvania are reportedly sifting through cold cases to search for links to Bryan Kohberger. Northampton County and Lehigh County started looking for links following his arrest. What do you make of that? Many people have surmised, have pontificated, for lack of a better phrase, this ain't his first rodeo. Do you believe, yes or no, he has struck before?
Well, it's hard to know. This killing that he's accused of course, is monumental when it comes to the effort that he has to go through. The startup period that led to this, if it actually came from the school and the problem he was having there with being discharged, took a lot of time to get him wound up and to do this slaughter. Has he done it before? It really, he certainly has tried to approach people before. I don't think there's any question of that. But to actually step over the line and injure somebody, I think we would know that information by now. Certainly local law enforcement, at least in Pennsylvania, have looked into that. The problem is everybody's so mobile today. He could have killed somebody in another state, in another time frame, and so you just don't know. But that's what VICAP for the FBI is all about. That's the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. And what they do is they take all the information from all of the various killers all over the country, and they crush them down into modus operandi. So that's where we're going to find out if he's done this before, or through the DNA that is now so effective in identifying people from decades ago that have killed individuals. As long as that evidence is kept, the chain of custody preserved, and the evidence of these murders preserved, where they're able to go back decades and identify somebody who's been there and was a potential suspect perhaps at the time, but there was not sufficient evidence to actually charge him.
Another thing is he may not have committed murders before, but he may have, and I fully believe he has, stalked before, peeping Tomed before, maybe assaulted before.
That is so smart, Nancy. Let me just tell you, when I taught this, we found individuals who would climb 30-foot trees with a pair of binoculars to watch a potential victim.
Whoa, wait a minute. Climb 30 feet up a tree to what, look in a window? Are you serious?
Absolutely.
That's a killer waiting to happen right there if you're going to climb a tree 30 feet. Dale Carson, have you ever climbed a tree?
Oh, I have, certainly.
I've climbed a tree. Oh, yes, we climbed trees. In fact, I was up in a tree the first time I could ever pronounce an R. Little known fact, when I was growing up, I couldn't say an R. I would say wivel. And that's really bad if your name is Nancy Grace. And I climbed up a tree and I was practicing my R's. Of course, we didn't have speech therapy or anything like that then. And I was going wivel, wivel. Finally said, river. And I heard it. And I jumped down and ran through the house going, river, river, river. So it's not easy to climb up a tree, Carson. And you're telling me there was a guy that climbed 30 feet up a tree just to peeping Tom?
Well, think about this. This is a biologic imperative driven by an obsession. And the combination of those two exponentially leads to an energy that I don't think most people can well understand.
You just used a lot of words to say masturbate, didn't you?
All right. Well, I mean, if you're crazy about looking at some gal through a window in the middle of the night, you're going to do what you have to do, just like I believe Kohberger did by laying out in the back of that house and watching the montage of windows that would appear in front of him backlit so that he could see directly into the rooms of these individuals that he ultimately is accused of slaughtering.
You know what, Dale? I bet he did that many more times than we know. And I remember in the warrant it said at least 12 times. They're not limiting themselves to just 12 peeping Toms. That's what it boils down to. I think he has peeping Tommed before. I think that he may have groped women before. He definitely belittled them or had misogynistic attitudes toward them before this.
You're right here, because women this is statistical. And I taught it back in 1989, 90, and I can just tell you that women are very reluctant to report that kind of behavior. So the frequency with which it happens, we don't really know the actual statistics, because women are concerned about reporting it. And it previously, years ago, of course, it was considered a woman's fault if that happened. Now, we've since matured out of that and understand that the men are responsible for their own behavior. But for many, many
it
decades,
didn't take me. I didn't have a dawning. I knew that the first time I heard about it. That it's the man's fault. It's the attacker's fault. But I am wondering if he had groped women, brushed up against them in an inappropriate or intentional manner. I guarantee
that's
you he
called
did.
pottery, what that's called.
Yeah.
And it happens in elevators frequently. And that's why if you ever get on the elevator with a strange person, you push all the buttons. That's your first step toward personal safety.
Does this mean you've read my book, Don't Be a Victim? Because that's in there, elevator safety. Okay, so what can we glean? We know that he couldn't stop himself. He could not control his behavior. He could not keep the bus in the middle of the road, even when he needed to save his job. He still couldn't do it. He could not change his behavior. And I think Dale Carson is right. I guess I'll say it too. I'll jump on the bandwagon. This ain't his first time at the rodeo. I don't know to what degree he has broken the law or violated women in one way or another, but I know this is not the first time. Now, if we can prove it. Dale Carson joining me, DaleCarsonLaw.com. We will meet on another day, friend, God willing.
I look forward to it.
Bye,
Thank you.
buddy.